Hi everybody, welcome. Welcome to Animation Week 13. The week in which I fully acknowledged at the outset that some of you in this class have a lot more knowledge about the history of anime than I do. And you know what? That's okay, because I can talk about what I want to talk about and what I know about. No, you have to stay in here with me. And you can talk about what you know about. And together, we will come up with a comprehensive understanding of anime. I'm just kidding. There's no way we can come up with a comprehensive understanding of anime. Inga! So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about some of the earliest years of Japanese art that led us to the creation of manga and anime. So we have a sense of some of the influences that led to Japanese animated art today. Then I'm going to say a little bit about early Japanese animation up until the 1950s to set us up for what I have for you to watch, which is Astro Boy. But I'm also going to link to a documentary series on anime that I think is really worth watching. So that's going to pick up some of the pieces that I might not address in detail. I'll give you a link to Astro Boy on the YouTube description here, but then I've also got Astro Boy for you on the Canvas site in case this link doesn't work, which is possible. Japanese animation part 1. So where do we start? We start with ukiyo-e. So I should say that I'm getting a lot of my information from the University of Michigan's awesome site on the history of anime written by Linda Scherer, and I will link to that in the description as well. So the term manga was created by the artist Hokusai, who you probably recognize because you've seen this image before. Hokusai was working in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and the term he gave to some of his artwork was made of the words man, meaning in spite of oneself, lax or whimsical, and ga, meaning picture. Put them together and get manga. The first examples of what we might call manga were picture scrolls created in the 6th and 7th centuries by Buddhist monks, and this is one of the most famous of those works, Shoujugiga, meaning animal scrolls, and that featured something that we've all become pretty familiar with by this time, anthropomorphism. And that means that animals are acting like humans, and that can be used as satire or commentary on what humans do, in this case, Buddhist priests. We start to see even more woodblock prints in the early 17th century. The most popular ones were called ukiyo-e, portraits of the floating world. So we see paintings of beautiful women, of kabuki actors and sumo wrestlers. We see landscapes, images of folk tales, and of course, erotica. In the early 17th century, Edo, which would become modern Tokyo, became the seat of the government for the military dictatorship. Under this political structure, the merchant class became rich, and their lifestyle, which involved kabuki theater, geisha, that sort of thing, was immortalized in these floating world images. And by the way, when Japan opened up to outside trade in the Meiji period in 1868, this version of Japanese art is the one that many other countries came to associate Japan with. Ironically, though, after the Meiji Restoration, the art form went into decline, but not before we get artists like Yoshitoshi, who became known for paintings with beautiful women, demons, and ghosts. Now, also during this period, Japanese artists were introduced to the way that European artists depicted shading, perspective, and anatomy. They also introduced word balloons in separate sequences. There were new printing techniques. And under European influence, the Japanese started making humor magazines similar to Punch, the most famous of which was Marumaru Chimbun in 1877. Now, at the end of the 19th century, we start seeing the first comic strips in New York, in Joseph Pulitzer's The World. And we start seeing comic strips in Japanese newspapers, and actually newspapers all over the world, pretty soon thereafter. By the 1920s and 30s, they're incredibly popular, but the Japanese government has started to get in on censoring comic strips, especially ones that might be critical of the government or policies in some way. So some magazines are going to close, some are going to censor themselves, and then some of them are just going to choose to send a representative to jail for the time being for the sake of the art. The other thing that happens during this time is that Japan is seeing what's going on in the US, the Fleischers, early Disney, and they're thinking that they can get in on the act too. Remember, we see a lot of the artistic sources for early animation is coming from the newspaper world, and that's going to be true in Japan as well. Early animators are going to be working individually or in small groups, just like we saw with the US. And interestingly, the government is going to subsidize educational films. So some filmmakers are going to be able to get grants for their short films if they can argue that their animation film has some kind of educational content. Now, we do not have a ton of early Japanese animated films, in part because of the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. This earthquake wiped out many film archives, and of course a lot of other things as well. There were about 140,000 people dead, and it destroyed two of Japan's largest cities and traumatized the entire nation, also whipping up nationalist and racist passions. I will link to a site by the Smithsonian on the Kanto earthquake as well. This is a depiction of the freak pillar of fire known as the dragon twist. Can you imagine how horrific this was? It had a huge influence on culture and society at the time. I mean, this is a tragic but fascinating part of Japanese culture because Japan, remember, is situated on the Pacific Rim, also known as the Ring of Fire. Between the dangers of earthquakes and volcanoes, and then after World War II, the very real memory of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the possibility of imminent and severe disaster permeates Japanese popular culture. So while you're thinking later on about why there are all these giant robots and why there are all these apocalypse films, I mean, it would behoove you to keep that in mind. Now, by the 1930s, again, we've got this kind of national militarism increasing, and it's related to this idea of needing to use things like comic strips for the purpose of propaganda. So animators are finding that they need to support the war effort in order to get funding. And as Fred Patton writes in Watching Anime, Reading Manga, the quantity of animated films grew as the war intensified. The first two animated features are 1943 and 1944, when the Imperial Navy commissioned Mitsuo Seiyo to produce dramatic fantasies to rouse the patriotic spirits of children. The second feature here, which is Momotaro, Divine Warriors of the Sea, shows the Imperial Navy as funny animals. Now, I mean, again, not unlike what's happening in the US and elsewhere during the world, cartoonists are being recruited for propaganda. And the ones who do are rewarded, and the ones who don't, at least in Japan, are persecuted. So it behooved many artists to get on board with supporting the official line of the government during this time. Now, after World War II, cartoons are going to flourish. The publishers who had been powerful before the war were now in shambles, which allowed many tiny new companies to grow. These tiny companies published extremely cheap comics called Red Books, and one of the Red Book artists was a medical student named Tezuka Osamu. But more about him in a second. So manga really emerges in the 1950s, and anime follows soon after. Here's where we get to the Toei Animation Company, Japan's first major animation studio. This is the first real anime feature, and it's also the first color anime feature, The Tale of the White Snake, or Tale of the White Serpent from 1958 by Taiji Yabushita. This and Toei's next few features were kind of attempts to emulate Disney, but they were using Asian legends, like, for instance, this is based on a Song Dynasty Chinese folktale and more historical themes that were appropriate for Japanese culture. This was a huge and expensive project that was also one of the first anime to be released in the US. And I would like to draw your attention here to the extremely cute red panda. This is worth watching. It didn't do incredibly well in the US, but as we get into the 1960s, Japanese animation will become popular in the US. I mean, again, there's a reason that they're emulating the US here, and it is not entirely unproblematic. That reason really has to do with cultural imperialism. There is a flood of US popular culture that enters Japan during this era. Comic books, films, US animated cartoons. These are all really accessible to the Japanese public, and they have a huge influence on the post-war generation. We're going to come back to this again, but before I forget, there's also the issue of technology, because with the Meiji period, Japan was introduced to a lot of new technologies all at the same time. And while Japan took this opportunity to become one of the most technologically advanced countries today, inherent in any kind of modernization process is the fear that something might take over, that technology might dehumanize in some way. So in much of anime, technology is presented as simultaneously advantageous, good, progressive, beneficial,
and is something to watch out for, because there's always this fear that it might take over too. Maybe it'll develop a mind of its own, even. In this way, the presence of technology can be likened to the presence of American influence itself after World War II. I mean, occupation lasts until 1953, and it began with the best of intentions, right? But it caused cultural upheaval, student and public protests, not to mention the lasting results of American cultural imperialism. So again, I'd just like you to keep this in mind as we're talking about the popularity of anime in America, that the technology-related themes can also be seen as a metaphor for the influence of American culture on Japanese culture and society. All right, with all that in mind, let's talk about Dr. Osamu Tezuka.
Osamu Tezuka, or Tezuka Osamu, Tezuka is his last name, is considered the father of manga in Japan. His nickname is Manga no Kami-sama, the god of comics. He was born in Osaka in 1928, but he died in Tokyo in 1989. As a teenager, Tezuka was interested in Charlie Chaplin's films, along with the animation of the Fleischers and of Disney. I mean, he was a comic book artist first, but he broke into animation in 1959 when Toei Studios gave him the chance to write and direct Sayuki, Western Diary or Journey to the West, which was based on a Chinese Buddhist legend. In the US, the film was edited, dubbed, and renamed Alakazam the Great. Now, his manga are known for this use of cinematic devices. Here are some examples of that. In his manga, we see an amazing sense of dynamism. We see panning. We see different camera angles. We see close-ups. Not just close-ups of characters, but close-ups of elements of, I don't know, what I'd call the mise-en-scène, right? We have such a sense of motion and such a sense of perspective in his manga. So pay attention to where you see that in the film as well. Now, at the same time, Tezuka was paying attention to what was going on in the US, particularly with Hanna-Barbera. Hanna and Barbera are realizing that the use of limited animation was the key to successful animation for television.
The public would accept limited animation as long as it was fast-paced and entertaining. And this was really great for the medium of television, where product needed to be cranked out at a really rapid pace.
So in 1961, he founded his own production company, Mushi, and created the first animated Japanese TV series, ASTRO Boy, which was about a robot child with a heart of gold. It was broadcast for the first time January 2nd, 1963. It's known as Tetsuwan Atomu in Japan and Astro Boy in the US. This was a huge success. It totally transformed animation in Japan, though I should say that some historians say that its influence has been overstated.
So what I want you to be thinking about while you're watching Astro Boy is, first of all, what kind of relationship do you see to technology? What does this remind you of? Do you see this as an ancestor of any other more recent cultural productions? How do you think that Tezuka is setting the bar for anime when it comes to visual style? I want you to especially look at the kawaii-ness, the cuteness of the characters, and what constitutes that cuteness. We're going to see a relationship between this and shoujo manga, which is a manga especially aimed at girls. His manga are also going to be known for cinematic devices. So where do you see cinematicness, camera angles being used in interesting and creative ways in this episode of Astro Boy? One more thing, Tezuka's characters are often known for being multidimensional. I mean, he's known as a humanist animator. And so he's known for giving depth and dimension to his characters. They're capable of mistakes. They're capable of redemption. They might even die. So where do you see elements of character depth in Astro Boy? What does it make you think of, and what does it make you feel? Okay, I hope you enjoy it.